Right, welcome to the Downtown Den, and our guest today is Paul Embery. Paul describes himself as a firefighter, a trade union activist, an advocate of blue Labour, but most recently, the author of this fine book, Despised, Why the Modern Left, I'm going the wrong way there, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. I've had a good flick through the book. In fact, I think I'm on the last chapter now. It's a fascinating read, Paul. So first of all, congratulations on putting such I think a constructive criticism of the modern Labour Party together in written form. But before we get into the content of the book, just tell us a little bit about your background before we get into the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Hi, everybody. Good to be with you. My background, Frank, really is someone who has been rooted in the Labour movement for the best part of about 26 years. I grew up in a very working class part of East London, the London borough of Barking and Dagenham, a very kind of blue collar working class area, a Labour heartland. It was the old traditional thing. They didn't count the Labour votes in Barking and Dagenham, they weighed them. My dad was, neither of my parents were particularly political, but my dad was a shop steward for the Transport and General Workers Union at his works depot. My mum worked for the GMB as a secretary. So I always kind of felt that pull towards the Labour Party, towards the trade union movement. I joined a trade union at 16 when I was stacking shelves in my local branch of Asda, and then I joined the fire service at the age of, I think, 22. Very quickly became involved with the Fire Brigades Union and ended up serving on the national executive of the Fire Brigades Union. I'm also a member of the National Union of Journalists now, as in my sort of parallel capacity as a writer. So all of that really, particularly my upbringing and living in that working class area, informed my politics, and I've been active, as I say, in the Labour movement for the best part of the last sort of quarter of a century. Really taken part in many campaigns and disputes, been on strike a number of times with the fire service. So that's kind of me, really. Yeah, that's the background to it all.
And you draw your conclusions in the book very much from that background and from the people who obviously you've grown up amongst and you still engage with. And some of the core values that you would associate with working class communities, they really do come to the fore. And I think that's where you start to see potentially some contradictions between what some in the modern Labour Party approach policy with and what actually working class voters want their representatives to be articulating.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think that kind of schism between the competing values has very much widened over the last 20 years or 30 years, and it is undeniable, I think, that the values of the left, the modern left, have become increasingly out of kilter with the values of ordinary working class communities who once upon a time felt very drawn towards the Labour Party, felt tribal in many cases towards the Labour Party, felt that the Labour Party spoke for them, represented them, the Labour Party welcomed them and wanted their votes. But I think there's that divergence in the values and the demographic between the two groups has occurred. So I think the working class have become increasingly alienated from the party. I mean, I'm still a member of the Labour Party, but I look at today's Labour Party, even compared, I think, to when I joined in 1994, is radically different in many ways. It's much more now the kind of middle class party. It's much more sort of rooted in the fashionable cities, very kind of London-centric, a party really of students and social activists. And increasingly, I think people within, not just the party, but the wider left, look upon those old working class communities, you know, post-industrial Britain, provincial Britain, areas of our sort of neglected coastal regions, etc., almost as if there's some sort of embarrassing elderly relative. These people are a bit reactionary, they're a bit bigoted, they're a bit xenophobic because they believe in old-fashioned concepts like patriotism and community and things like that. And they're very rooted in their place in their community. They've got a sense of belonging, and that doesn't really fit with the modern left's embrace of the precepts of cosmopolitan liberalism. And it's no surprise, frankly, that the Labour Party and the wider left, I think, has seen itself now abandoned really by the working class, and because of the things I've said, I think it's got nobody to blame but itself, really.
Well, your analysis, Paul, and you date back the decline of Labour's vote within working class communities, not from the Corbyn leadership, but you actually go as far back as to the new Labour government, and you suggest that perhaps is where the rot started to set in.
Yeah, and I really believe that very strongly, and I argue vociferously with people in the Labour Party who seem to think that the Labour Party's troubles set in and the disconnect with the working class set in when Jeremy Corbyn took over, and in fact, the whole divide predates Jeremy Corbyn by some time, as far as I'm concerned, and yes, I do sort of date it back to just before the New Labour days, and then under Blair, I think it exacerbated. And I would say particularly, and this is what I saw with my own eyes in my own community in Barking and Dagenham, where I was living at the time. The first decade, I think, of this century was quite pivotal in that schism widening between the left, the Labour Party, and the working class. I think this was a period, the first decade particularly of this century, where we began to see the really kind of acute effects of globalization start to take hold in some of those working class communities. So we saw, on the one hand, the impact of globalization in terms of the free movement of capital and, deindustrialization in many places, and entire blue collar industries and factories closing down, and thousands of jobs being shipped abroad, and those jobs being replaced by nothing particularly solid, but often people would end up working in the gig economy, precarious employment, etc. So we saw that, and that caused a certain amount of disruption. And combined with that was also the free movement of labour. Those effects began to take hold, I think, in the first decade of this century as well. So we saw very rapid and large-scale movements of labour. And I set out in the book how that impacted on my own community. The figures are pretty stark. Barking and Dagenham really underwent some very, very profound demographic changes at the time. And what happened is people felt very kind of bewildered and disorientated by that. And that was often dismissed by the political establishment, particularly the left, as being driven by, some sort of racism or xenophobia. And it really wasn't. It wasn't that people's sense of race had been disturbed. It was their sense of order had been disturbed. These are effects of globalization in terms of rapid movements of capital and labour were causing very, very profound implications in their communities. And when these people looked to the labour movement and said, look, you're our representatives, can you just kind of slow this down? Our sense of place and community is being disrupted. There's very, violent social and economic disruption going on locally. They were kind of patronised and told, well, actually, this is very good for you. This will improve the nation's GDP, and this will bring you cultural enrichment, etc. And they were patronised to the extent where, in the end, they were driven, in my case, where I live, to the far right. The BNP won 12 seats on the council in 2006. Its best ever performance in local government. And it was about then, really, that I started saying to people in the movement, look, you need to listen, because this is not driven by racism. This is just driven by ordinary people whose sense of place and order has been disrupted. But they didn't listen, and they went on ignoring those people or paying lip service to them. And we ended up where we did.
Well, would you concede, Paul, though, that new Labour government did do some positive things for those working class communities? Because, my recollection, having grown up in Skelmersdale, for example, was that the disenfranchisement, I can't get my words out today.
I know what you mean.
Those that felt disenfranchised were long before Tony Blair emerged, and actually probably long before what we would now describe as the liberal left were a real force. During the Margaret Thatcher years, there were many working class communities that felt as though they'd been abandoned. And my take on this is, as with all governments, you can look back to the years of Margaret Thatcher's premiership, and you can pick up, if you're from our side of the political fence, some really bad things that she did, but then there's some positives as well. Likewise with New Labour. And I just felt that, in both cases, strong leaders, obviously, Blair and Thatcher, they had big jobs. And it was almost as if there was too much for them to do. And inevitably, they're not going to get everything right.
Yeah, and I'll be the first to say that certainly, there were some very good things done under New Labour. The investment in schools and hospitals and tax credits and things like that were undoubtedly things that were brought in the interests of ordinary working class people, benefited working class people. Arguably were things that we wouldn't have got under the Tories. I don't want to give the impression that absolutely everything that was done under New Labour was bad. Where I think New Labour fouled was not in being prepared to challenge the dominance of capital. It largely, I think, made its peace with the system, certainly with some of the less desirable elements of the free market system as well. I think Blair was someone who took and I think he would admit this openly, he took a very kind of hands-off approach to the economy, really. He just saw the government as an enabling government, stabilise the economy, then get out of the way, and let the free market do its job. I would have liked to have seen a much more traditional interventionist government, a government that was prepared to intervene proactively in the economy to rebalance it in favour of ordinary working class people. I don't think we really saw that in the New Labour years, despite much of the good that it did. And I think ultimately, because the Labour Party was so kind of wedded during the Blair years to the precepts of what I call cosmopolitan liberalism, and thought that, I think there was a certain amount of complacency. I think they just concluded that the working class really had nowhere else to go. And that, there was always going to be a stigma attached to voting Tory in these places. So, these people would always vote Labour. But what I think happened in the first decade of this century under New Labour is that we just saw millions of working class people start to abstain. And in some cases, they went to parties like UKIP and, as I said earlier, the BNP. I guess, Frank, yes, it did much good and much that it can be proud about. But on some of the really important stuff, I think that in terms of challenging the precepts of globalization, I think it fell short, and I think it paid a price for that.
And then, we fast forward to the Brexit debate. And of course, a vote that I think did surprise many in the country, certainly surprised the establishment in the country. And I don't think that David Cameron would have called a referendum had he not been confident that he was going to win it. Now, listen, I was a staunch Remainer, campaigned to remain, felt it was a mistake to leave the European Union. I don't want to rerun that debate again. We are where we are. But having read your book, I think there are certain things in terms of the tactics that we used from the Remain side of the campaign that you certainly have to question now. But also, I think you state a very strong case as to why people in places like Dagenham, in places like Skelmersdale, and many other working class areas, they did vote to leave the EU.
Yeah, and I kind of, in the book, as you would have seen, I suggest it was a bit like a general strike. We haven't had a general strike in this country since 1926, obviously, not that some of us in the trade union movement haven't been trying, but I kind of felt that many people who voted Brexit perhaps knew that in the short term it would cause some economic turbulence, it would disrupt operations, might even in the short term hit them in the pocket potentially. But in the same way that when workers go on a strike, they were prepared to take that short-term hit as they saw it in order to achieve something better in the future. The system as they saw it, the economy, had fundamentally stopped working for them. And the people who they saw as being responsible for their predicament, the fact that they were, living in substandard housing, earning low wages, the local public services were under strain because of free movement, etc. And all of the difficulties and stresses they were facing in their lives, those same people who they thought were responsible for that were suddenly now begging for their loyalty and begging for their vote. And they didn't, frankly, unsurprisingly, feel particularly inclined to do it, to give them that vote. And it was almost like, I think, the people have been presented with a gun with one bullet in it, and were told, this is the time, if you're ever going to fire it, to do it now, and you can really make an impact. Because when these people voted in general elections, they didn't feel that it had the same impact, or they could affect or upset the political status quo in the way that they could do with this one-off vote. And despite everything that was thrown at them and all the warnings that were given, they said, look, this is what we're going to do, and you'd better, you've got to suck it up. And in many respects, I argue in the book, it was clearly an EU vote. I think millions of these people didn't particularly like the EU. They saw it as anti-democratic. They didn't like the fact that the British Parliament was, in their eyes, subservient to it in many ways. But it was as much an anti-UK establishment vote as much as anything. And it was in places like Barking and Dagenham, where there was a higher Leave vote. You could see this stuff coming a mile off. People were so alienated from the political system for the reasons that I said earlier. And when that same political system, in terms of the main political parties, the banking industry, big business, etc., pretty much everybody was suddenly demanding their loyalty, as I say, not surprisingly, they weren't prepared to give it. And the seeds of that were sown many years before Brexit. I'm sure of that.
Now, you referenced this earlier, Paul, but for me, the key issue within the whole Brexit debate was freedom of movement. And I think that was couched from many in the Remain camp as racists for leaving the EU. So if you were going to leave on the basis that you didn't like immigration, then you were a racist. And I think what you've done in the book is put a very concise and coherent argument together as to why that actually isn't the case. So there are people who are concerned about freedom of movement and about the difference that immigration, quite significant numbers of immigrants coming into the country between that period, 97 and 2001, I think, had on their communities. But we shouldn't necessarily equate that with them being racist.
Absolutely true, and it was something that used to make me tear my hair out when I was living in Barking and Dagenham, and I saw the profound changes that were taking place. And for the most part, the people in places like that, I think, are decent, tolerant, accommodating people. But I think they felt that their faith on this issue, their faith had just been abused on it. Their trust had been abused when it came to issues like free movement. And I think the sad thing in many respects is the whole issue of immigration was largely becoming a bit of a non-issue in this country. I mean, it certainly didn't have the resonance or the impact that it had in the 1970s, for example, when the National Front were on the march and standing in elections and winning, a certain amount of support. And it was an issue that was being sidelined because it wasn't particularly an issue in people's lives. But then with the impacts of globalization and free movement, and the very profound changes that began to occur in communities, the whole debate became quite toxified, and an issue that had been largely put to bed in many places suddenly reared its head again. And you look at Barking and Dagenham, for example, Frank, and I mean, the far right never had a foothold in Barking and Dagenham. I lived there for 35 years, and they never got near the place. They'd penetrated other parts of East London, but Barking and Dagenham was always Labour. And in 2006, they just came out of nowhere because people's concerns were just not addressed and people were patronised and paid lip service to. The far right just came out of nowhere, and as I said earlier, won 12 seats on the council, their best ever performance in local government. And it was clear to me that it was because people were being ignored. Now, I think there are all sorts of economic arguments against free movement as well. I think in many respects it's a boss's dream. Free movement allows bosses to shunt workers from low wage economies to high wage economies in order to cut wages, etc. So and I, as a socialist, I always find it a bit bizarre that so many people on the left nowadays don't believe in regulating the labour supply. The labour supply is a market dynamic, as far as I'm concerned, which, like all market dynamics, should be regulated to secure the best outcome for workers. But socially, particularly in places like Barking and Dagenham, it really had an impact. And as I said before, it was not because people's sense of race had been violated. It was because their sense of order had been violated and everything they were familiar with had been violated. And I'm absolutely certain that people in Barking and Dagenham and places like it, if numbers had been modest and manageable, I think they would have absorbed that comfortably. There would have been no tensions. There would have been no reaction in the way that we saw. But because effectively they were told, there you go, that's globalization, nothing we can do about it, get on with it, suck it up. By the way, it's good for you and good for the economy. They didn't buy it, and they saw the Labour Party as being responsible for foisting that ideology on them. And that's why so many of them turned against the party.
And when you talk about working class core values, you mentioned the word patriotism before. And again, it frustrates me and angers me to an extent as well, Paul, that we in this country have allowed the far right, I'm not talking about the mainstream political parties here now, but the far right, to hijack our flag. Incredibly, Keir Starmer had the audacity a couple of weeks ago to do an address to the country with the Union Jack behind and was slated by members of his own party. For me, I do think there's become a disconnect among some within the Labour movement, particularly that far left, who see, patriotism again as some form of racism. And again, the famous quote, which I think you do reference in your book, came from Emily Thornberry, didn't it, at the time, when she spotted a guy who had a Union Jack in his house and sort of berated them for it. So, is that something that the Labour Party can come back from, is starting to address, do you think?
It's going to be hard because, as you say, I think there are so many people in the party now who are just instinctively hostile to any expression of patriotism or British identity or English identity. I'm not someone who, I don't like jingoism. I don't like overt displays of national identity. I'm not someone who thinks that we should have kids singing the national anthem in assembly or saluting the Union Jack and things like that. But I do believe that in most working class communities up and down the country, there is a quiet, understated affinity for country, love for country, that isn't actually driven by any sort of feeling of national superiority or racial superiority. It's just that kind of natural instinctive patriotism that many people feel, but so many people on the left don't actually understand that. And I think it's because their belief is driven by the idea that in order to have a love of one's own country and to show patriotism towards one's own country, it must by definition be exclusionary. It must mean that you dislike other countries. It must mean that you dislike Johnny Foreigner. And of course, it means nothing of the sort. In the same way that people feel an affinity for their local town or for their local football team or the county where they live or whatever, that's just, I believe, that patriotism is just a natural extension of that. So until, and yeah, I saw the Starmer thing as well, and I knew instantly when he was given that speech with the Union Jack behind him, I knew instantly that there would be people within the left, and particularly the far left, who would denounce him as flirting with the far right. And I saw comments of him about him, reinventing Oswald Mosley and all this sort of nonsense. And frankly, while that kind of thinking remains present in the Labour Party, then it's unlikely to reconnect with working class people. Because for me, if you if you purport to be, a serious political party who's attempting to gain power, if large parts of your party, large numbers within it, actively dislike their own country, then you might as well kiss goodbye now to any chance of winning, because people will not vote for a party that is deemed to be hostile to patriotism or disliking its own country. So until Labour gets back to understanding what drives that patriotism, then no, I don't think it will reconnect.
The other area that you feature heavily in the book, Paul, is what some will describe as cancel culture, others wokedom. This, I would say, goes beyond the Labour Party and the left, though. I find it increasingly difficult now to engage in any discourse around those issues without expecting an avalanche of, I'll use the technical term, shit to be thrown at you if you dare suggest that there might be an alternative view to some of those social issues that are often raised now. And again, I think within your book, I have to say, fabulous analysis really in terms of how many people, and I don't just think working class people, feel about those issues. But we're now in a place where actually people are almost scared to articulate their views, because you have, these big social media platforms, and even in the mainstream media now, almost an instinctive approach to being anti any view that doesn't fit in with that set of liberal elite approach to some of those things that you talk about.
Yeah, and I think it's a real worry. I think it's undeniable, actually, that we are seeing this kind of cancel culture taking hold more and more. And what strikes me is that where once upon a time, if people disagreed with you, they would say, I disagree with you, and you'd have a debate, and you might convince the other person, you might not. It's increasingly common now for people to say, not I disagree with you, but you mustn't say that. That's offensive. Almost as if that's the clincher in a debate. Simply saying that you're offended is a way of shutting down the debate. And I think that has led to a kind of climate, particularly on the left, but you're right, not exclusively on the left by any stretch. I think it infects our whole kind of political system in many respects, and our cultural life across the piece. But it's certainly, I think, in many respects been driven by the left, where on many views there's expected to be, a conventional opinion, an orthodox opinion. And no one, particularly if they've got a public profile or if they're in a position of influence, dare kind of step outside of that without there being some sort of repercussion. And I think it's disturbing that the marketplace of ideas is being shut down. As I say in the book, I don't argue that we should go out of our way to gratuitously offend people. I don't believe in upsetting people just because you can. But if you voice a particular political or moral opinion, and it's a genuinely held belief, and someone's offended by that, then frankly, the problem, I think, is with the person being offended, not the person who's just giving a view. I'm a great believer that, we exchange ideas and we debate them. And I'm not suggesting at all that, opinions should be ring-fenced from criticism, or people should be ring-fenced from criticism. If you voice an opinion in the public sphere, you've got to expect to engage in debate. But this ideology that says we know platform people, this person is so beyond the pale, we won't even though he might even be on the left, we won't debate with this person, or we demand that this social media platform don't give this person a voice, or we demand that his employer, her employer, sacks him for what he or she has said. That, I think, is becoming more and more common. I think it doesn't help that it's backed up in many respects by increasingly repressive legislation in some of these areas. And I do think there needs to be a kind of non-partisan campaign to push back against some of this stuff. I don't really see the politicians doing it because I don't think they're brave enough, frankly, to put their head above the parapet. I think it needs to be ordinary people who say, actually, we're not going to stand for this nonsense.
Now, a culmination, Paul, of those things you spoke about and other issues led, of course, in December 2019 to a whole wave of former Labour voters switching their support to the Conservative Party, which has led to an 80-odd seat majority for Boris Johnson. Now, will those people who switched the vote 12 months on now be sat at home thinking they made the right decision, do you think?
I think some of them will. I think probably it's too early to tell for most people. I mean, it's certainly a big step for many people. These communities, some of which have been voting Labour since time immemorial, and where there was previously, I think, a stigma attached to voting Tory, many people saw it as a taboo, and we heard stories at the general election of people, when they were in the voting booth and they heard their sort of dead granddad whispering over their shoulder, "What are you doing voting Tory?" So it was a big leap for many people, but it's like any taboo, having broken it once, it then doesn't become as hard to do it a second time. So I think, it's going to be crucial whether the Tories are seen to deliver in those communities. I mean, obviously they made all sorts of promises. They talked about ending austerity. They talked about, regenerating areas, investing in areas, new infrastructure, jobs, investing in industries, levelling up, tackling regional inequalities, etc. If people see when the next general election comes in those places that their lives and their communities have been tangibly improved, then yes, I think there is a good chance that they will vote Tory again. If they feel they've been let down, if they feel that the promises fizzled out into nothing, then they won't. But incidentally, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll turn back to the Labour Party. I think what may happen is like millions of working class former Labour voters did in the first decade of this century, they might end up just abstaining or perhaps going to another right-wing minor party. And I think also what the Labour Party needs to understand, and I don't think many people inside the party do, that anyone who thinks that things can't get worse needs to think again. Because if you look at some of those seats that Labour held in 2019, including some of those red wall seats, as they're called, some of the majorities were actually quite narrow. And if the Tories are seen to deliver by the time of the next election, some of those seats could potentially fall as well. So there's a huge job of work to be done by the Labour Party. First, they have to, First, the Conservatives would have to foul, I think, to deliver in those communities for Labour to win them back. But that would be a necessary but an insufficient step in many respects, because Labour itself has got to change radically before it can have any chance, I think, of winning the hearts and minds back of those communities.
Okay, Paul. So what do some of those key changes look like for you then? In terms of Keir Starmer will be starting to think about putting an alternative programme together. I think it's a bit unfair to suggest that he should have done that, less than a year into him succeeding Jeremy Corbyn. But nonetheless, in the not too distant future, people will be looking to the Labour Party to see what policies they have to take us through what is going to be a critical time post-pandemic. But for you, what are the key things that he and Labour need to start to say to win back the trust of those votes that they've lost?
Well, I think that the two things they need to do, first of all, I think on the economy, I think there's scope for Labour to maintain a degree of radicalism on the economy. I think people in those red wall seats and beyond actually have had quite enough of austerity over the course of the last decade. I think actually, whatever criticisms I had of Jeremy Corbyn, I think some of the stuff that he and John McDonnell developed economically, what became known as kind of Corbynomics, which was often kind of dismissed as, hard left Stalinist Soviet style economics, but in many respects just kind of broadly Keynesian mixed economy approach in many respects. I think some of that stuff actually is quite popular. I mean, I think out there working class communities don't particularly like the impact of globalization and the dominance of international capital over so many parts of our lives. I don't think they like the gap between rich and poor, and they want it closed. They want regional inequalities tackled. They want bordering excesses tackled. They want a higher minimum wage. So I think some of that stuff is broadly popular, and it's not necessary for Labour to step back necessarily from some of that stuff. I think where the real job of work is for Labour is in closing the cultural divide with those communities. I think that's where Labour needs to move heaven and earth to try to reconnect with people. I think it needs to take a much more communitarian approach in its outlook and its policy development. I think it needs to start talking about the themes that matter to working class people. It shouldn't be ashamed to talk about patriotism. It shouldn't be ashamed to talk about family, about community. It should talk about the issues that, much more about the issues that are doorstep issues, as I would call them. The issues that often Labour activists get uncomfortable talking about. They stare down at the ground and shuffle their feet in embarrassment. The things that come up on the doorstep, things like law and order, for example, things like immigration. People are, worried about things like national security. What has happened to Labour is where the party itself has become so more middle class over the years. They've become much more comfortable about talking about more middle class pursuits and putting those things front and centre of their programme. So things like, I'm not saying for a moment these things are not important, but things like climate change and migrant rights and trans rights and all of this sort of stuff, which actually are not doorstep issues. People, for example, on climate change, is of course we know a mainstream political party has to discuss that. But for many people in working class communities, when they're talking to a Labour activist on the doorstep, they're not thinking, I want to discuss climate change. That's one of those issues that they expect politicians to deal with. It's a kind of back burner issue. Labour has got to be much better and much more comfortable with talking about the things that stress people in their everyday lives, get onto that territory, understand what motivates people, understand what their concerns are. And until that cultural divide, I think, starts closing, then things won't change. I mean, I should say, Frank, I've been quietly impressed with some of the stuff Starmer's done. He wasn't my leader of choice, to be honest. But I think he's got some good people around him who do understand this stuff. And some of his speeches, I think, have pressed some of these buttons around family and patriotism, community. So I've been pleased to see that. The Union Jack thing obviously annoyed lots of people on the far left of the party. So that's all good stuff as far as I'm concerned. But there's still a long way to go, and it's got to be fleshed out in policy as well. Not just sound bites. It's got to be reflected in policy development too.
Does he need a big row, a big fight, similar to Kinnock with Militant in Liverpool back in the 80s, do you think?
Not necessarily. Funny enough, I was watching an old Newsnight report about, it was actually about Tony Blair and his big fight on Clause 4 just after he took over, and they referenced the Kinnock fight with Militant back in the 80s. I don't necessarily think he should go seeking a big fight, because I think sometimes internal civil wars can be a bit of a distraction and can hobble parties when they're trying to develop policy for the future, etc. I'm not instinctively hostile to everybody on the far left. I think, if you look at some of them, if you look at some of the people around Momentum, I think they've brought a certain energy and a certain enthusiasm into the party, some of which is good. I mean, I think some of their ideas are profoundly wrong, but I'm happy to have the debate with those people. What I would say is this: no, I don't think he should necessarily go seeking a fight. I don't think there should be a purge. I don't particularly believe in political purges. But if sticking to these things that I said he should stick to happens to result in people saying, well, the Labour Party is not for me, some people on the far left walking away, I don't exactly think he should go out of his way to win them back, and I don't think he should lose any sleep about it. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Well, we'll keep a watching brief in terms of Keir's performance over the next 12 months and beyond, I'm sure. But Paul, today is the inauguration day for a new president in the United States, Joe Biden, and some will say that there's lessons to be learned from Labour, from the Democratic Party. They certainly selected a candidate who couldn't be described as anything other than mainstream in terms of Democrat politics, and he defeated a very popular sitting incumbent, in Donald Trump. And, although he lost the election, he gained more votes than any other presidential candidate in history. I think it was 75 million in the end. Is there some lessons that British politicians from across the spectrum can learn from the Trump years? Because it's been, whatever your views of the guy, a fascinating rise politically for an individual who almost through force of personality took over the apparatus of a political organisation in the biggest democracy in the world, and has totally changed the face of that country.
Yeah, and it's been fascinating in many ways because, yeah, I do think, I think there are parallels between Britain and America, and the way that politics has played out in both countries over the last 5, 6, 7 years. We've got the Red Wall, they've got the Rust Belt. I think there's been a big cultural divide opening up in America in the same way that there's been in Britain. I think that polarization exists on both sides of the pond. I mean, I loathe Trump. I think he's an awful human being, and I'm not sad to see him go. But it's undeniable that he did tap in to that feeling of alienation amongst blue collar America, amongst Rust Belt America. These people who, like I said earlier about places like Barking and Dagenham, people who'd seen the very profound impacts of globalization in their communities and didn't particularly like it. So he kind of had all the rhetoric to win those people over. I think there's a real danger, I think, for the Labour Party in Britain if they look at the fact that the Democrats have won in America, that Biden's won in America, that the Labour Party kind of says, oh, okay, we don't really need to change much then. Trump was an aberration in America, and they've realised their mistake, and he's gone now. We're back to normality in America. The same thing will happen in Britain. The Red Wall will realise that they've made a mistake by voting for Boris Johnson and the Tories, and actually, if we just hold the line, we don't really change much, then the votes will come flooding back to us. And I think that's a real misunderstanding of the situation. I mean, I've heard Democrat politicians regularly over the last few weeks in America say, it's a return to normality, or normalcy, as they called it. It's now back to normalcy. And they don't seem to understand that it was that normalcy that actually drove support for Trump in the first place and resulted in some of the political eruptions that we saw in America. And I think that there's the same danger here, actually, that if we just put Brexit down to an aberration, we just put the Red Wall crumbling and voting Tory down to an aberration, we don't have to change much. People will realise their mistake and come back to us. I think that will sound the death wish, actually, for the Labour Party as a serious electoral force. I think the Labour Party needs to accept now that it needs to undergo radical change if it wants to reconnect with people in those communities, because they will not come back to Labour unless the Labour Party is prepared to welcome them again and stop treating them like some sort of embarrassing elderly relative, like it's done over the last couple of decades.
And there's two significant differences as well, isn't there, in terms of how American and British politics work, and indeed in the terms of the personalities. Boris Johnson's not Donald Trump. I know Trump described him as the British Trump, but I don't think Boris would thank him for that badge of honour, particularly now. But equally, we know that the Conservative Party are not shy in changing leaders if they think that electorally it's pragmatic to do so. There is absolutely no guarantee for Keir Starmer that the person he'll be facing at the next general election is Boris Johnson, is there?
No, none whatsoever. And you're quite right. The Tories have got a history of regicide, haven't they? They've got no qualms about kicking out their leader if they think that they're an electoral liability, whereas Labour has traditionally been a bit more reluctant to do that. So no, as I touched on before, if there are certainly people in the Labour Party who kind of think that 2019 was the nadir, it can't get any worse, but it really can. And as I said, it's not just about hoping that the Conservative Party messes up and expecting the Conservative Party to fail, because it would be, I think, delusional to think that those millions of votes are going to be flooding back to Labour. What will happen is people will simply abstain, or, as I said, vote for the minor parties. So Labour, I think, has got to concentrate on getting its own house in order, on radically changing itself and coming up with themes and policy development and messaging that actually, relates to those doorstep issues that people care about, and shows people that their daily priorities are again the priorities of the Labour Party, because they haven't been for a very long time. And I've been in the Labour Party for 26 years, and I've seen that divide open up, and it's been tragic in many ways, and it needs to close.
Paul, thanks for that. I think my neighbour's just about to start working on his IKEA cabinet, as Peter Moss has described it again. So I will mute myself as I open the conversation up to our other guests in the downtown den this morning. Apologies for being distracted a little early because of the noise next door. He's a bloody West Ham supporter as well, so I'll be having a serious conversation with him when I've finished this. Listen, there's a question being posted in the chat room from Anthony. Anthony, do you want to put your question to Paul directly? I'll just mute myself and we'll.
Of course I'm muted. Why wouldn't I be? Really enjoyed that, Paul. I think there was a lot of some great stuff in there. And, you know, I'm a Labour supporter for many years and come from a background. My family live in Blackpool, and they have, for reasons that have always missed me, been Conservative voters. And I think that stems back from maybe from the 1970s, really. But my question in the chat was really quite a flippant one as to whether or not you could blame New Labour for a move towards voters moving towards UKIP, and whether or not that actually that move to the move towards UKIP and the more non-mainstream parties was really just as a result of all political parties actually moving to taking a more centrist approach to things. With actually what we've seen is the centre widening and the left and the traditional left and rights becoming more extreme. And how do we go about that whilst maintaining the values that the Labour Party have traditionally stood for, rather than trying to be, we're not the Conservative Party and we're actually trying to appease the moderates, really, rather than have it. I suppose the question is, how can you deliver traditional Labour policies whilst recognizing where that electorate is after decades of, you know, mismanagement of the political system?
Thanks for that, Anthony. Yeah, I broadly agree with the analysis. There was undoubtedly a convergence into what's called the centre ground. I mean, I always think that when people call themselves centrists, it's kind of a little bit arrogant, I think, because it's almost to assume that, you know, the centre ground is the common sense area in British politics, and anything that's kind of away from the centre is somehow illegitimate or extreme. It's a way for people to say, look, you know, we're in touch with the mainstream. And people have different ideas of what the centre actually means. And, you know, the axis itself shifts, the centre ground itself shifts, doesn't it, over time? But there was certainly a convergence on what people call the centre ground around the precepts of liberal centrism. So ideologically, I don't think there was a huge amount of difference between Cameron and Blair, for example. Certainly in terms of their kind of overall ideological approach. And I think that did, yes, the evidence is that did alienate, you know, millions of working class people and drove lots of people away from the Labour Party. Many of them had abstained, as I said earlier. Some of them, you know, flocked towards UKIP, and unfortunately, in my area and others, they flocked towards the BNP as well. In terms of kind of how to address that, I mean, I say in the book that, and you know, I'm sure you all know the history of the Labour Party. It's always been a historical electoral compromise between what I call in the book Hartlepool and Hampstead. It's had its kind of traditional working class, blue collar base, the Hartlepools, you know, the kind of communities and people it was set up in the first place to represent. But there's always been within the Labour Party since its very early days that layer of kind of middle class, liberal, intellectual, activist base that had been sympathetic to the idea of a Labour government, wants to see a fairer economy, believe the Labour Party is a better vehicle for achieving that. And in my view, Labour's always been at its best when it's been able to hold that coalition together. I certainly don't argue, and I say this clearly in the book, that all Labour should do is concentrate on that traditional blue collar working class base, because that's enough to bring us victory. I don't think it would be. We do need to build that broad coalition. I think in order to achieve that, what you have to do is to start with your base and then reach outwards. I think what Labour, under New Labour did, and in more recent years as well, has kind of just taken that base for granted, and has just concentrated so much, I think, on the kind of middle class liberal city-based vote, that in the end, the working class base that it thought would be with it forever has just kind of has crumbled away. And in the same way, I think it's also it's almost a reverse process of what we saw in the 90s. So when Blair came in the 90s and said, you know, we've got the working class, but that's not enough. We need to appeal to middle England. We need to appeal to broader swathes of the middle class, and did so and was able to win that fantastic landslide in 97. It's almost now that process in reverse, I think. You know, that middle class vote is pretty much still there within the Labour Party. And Labour now needs to reach back to its working class vote. And it's the middle class element that now needs to make a compromise in the way that the working class did in the 1990s. So I'm absolutely in favour of that coalition. I don't want to alienate middle class liberals in London and elsewhere from the party. I think they've got a huge role to play in it. But they do need to understand it's their turn now to make the compromise if Labour's ever going to be successful again.
Thank you. Great.
I'm just trying to talk over the drill now. So Andy McIntyre, Peter Moss, and David want to ask questions. I'll bring you in first, Peter, if I may.
Thanks, Frank. Good morning. Yes, thanks for that, Paul. Really, really interesting, and you've given me certainly food for thought. I'm Peter Moss, Deputy Leader at Preston City Council. Our paths have crossed previously. I was on the Officers' National Committee of the FBU at the time. That was at the time when you used to call us Ruperts, because we were seen as the posh element of the Favourite Age Union. But anyway, I won't hold that against you, don't worry. No, my point really, you've discussed lots of sort of broad principles really, and I suppose it's not trying to catch you out question, but why do you see the sort of some people on the left are more concerned with ideological purity than they are with pragmatism and winning elections? Thanks.
Should I come back on that now, Frank?
Yeah, I'm going to take over from Frank actually, because he's having difficulties there, Paul. So, but yeah, by all means, come back on that straight away.
Okay, thanks, Simon. It's interesting. Hi, Peter, by the way. The reality is, I think that there are people on the left who have always been more interested in political purity and ideological purity than the pragmatism and the hard compromises that are necessary to win elections. I mean, I guess they've all got their own individual reasons for that. I think that some people sometimes think that the battle itself almost is more important than the victory, and that, you know, as long as they can, in their own minds, put their heads on the pillar at night and say, I've made no compromise, I've stayed true to everything that I believe in, to my principles, then that's ultimately what matters to them. Now, okay, in some respects that's fine. If that's important to you, then do that. But you need to understand what the consequences are of that. If you're not prepared actually to be pragmatic, to reach compromise, to take those hard decisions that mean that you do compromise with the electorate rather than saying no compromise with the electorate, then it means ultimately that you reduce your opportunity to win, because you're not reaching out to that broad base, you're not appealing across the board, and you're allowing the way through for the Tories to come in and dominate. I think that's just, in truth, Peter, I think that's just part of hard left, far left ideology. I mean, I always find it, I've been active, as I said, in the Labour movement for 26 years. In the early part of that, I was fairly close to some of these far left groups. And it always struck me that the amount of time and effort they would dedicate to fighting each other over pretty obscure, often ancient matters of ideology, rather than concentrating on having a discussion with, you know, what I would call normal people, normal working class people, and finding out what their priorities are and putting those front and centre, was bizarre. But as I say, I think that's because they were more interested in the battle itself. I don't think that's ever going to change. The question, I think, is the damage potentially that these people can do to the Labour Party if they had that kind of hard line approach and they're not prepared to compromise. Because the truth is that I mean, let's be blunt about it. Many of these people have come into the Labour Party since Corbyn took over. They would never, if they stood for election under their own umbrella, and sometimes they do, and they get trifling votes. So there is a clear sense of opportunism that they're using the Labour Party as a vehicle to try to win support for a programme that they would never win on its own. But we should have the discussion with these people. We need to explain why they're wrong. And as I said, if they leave the party, I don't think there should be a purge, but if they leave the party, I don't think we should necessarily cry any tears over it.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks. Can I bring in David? David, you asked your own question, but it's about Scotland, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Hi, Paul. That's really interesting. Good to connect with you. I suppose one of the things that hasn't been mentioned is the issue of Scotland. And you look historically, going back 20 years or so, Labour was basically a slam dunk in terms of the number of seats that they get in Scotland. And given the rise of the SNP, to my mind, that just makes it much more difficult now for Labour to gain power. And I suppose in the short to medium term, it just feels like the bar is significantly higher now for them to gain overall power than it was maybe 25 years ago. It'd be interesting to just get your view on that and how you see that going. Because I suppose you could take a step back and think, as a Labour supporter, Scotland gaining independence might not be the worst answer for the Labour Party. I'm sure they would never say that publicly because it's all about keeping the union together, but be interested to hear your views on that.
Thanks. Yeah. Scotland's a real problem, and there are no easy answers to it. And you're right. I mean, if you look at 20, 30 years ago, the dominance that Labour had in many parts of Scotland, and you actually had big beasts from Scotland, people like Gordon Brown and Robin Cook and Donald Dewar and Alistair Darling, and in many parts of Scotland, I think Labour was almost unassailable. But it's a huge battle to win Scotland back, and I don't think there are any easy answers. One of the problems I think is that I'm in favour of devolution, but Blair kind of pitched the idea, and others in New Labour pitched the idea of devolution as a means really of choking off support for independence. I think actually with hindsight, what it's done is it's just given momentum. Devolution has given momentum to that campaign for independence, and of course so it's allowed the SNP to flourish. I think now, with the Tories also being in Westminster, it's almost like a perfect storm for Labour in Scotland, because we know what an anti-Tory feeling there is in large parts of Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon, entirely opportunistically in many cases, just blames the Tories for everything. With the Tory government in Westminster, it seems to me that support for independence always increases. So to kind of reduce that support for independence, you would need a Labour government in Westminster. How do you get a Labour government into Westminster until it can win back large parts of Scotland? So it's almost like a catch-22 for Labour. I think in the speech that he gave recently, Keir Starmer, talking about rolling out greater devolution, I think is probably the right way to go. Because if you are going to attract back any of those people who are tempted by independence, then perhaps giving them greater devolution is one way of doing that, now at least. But no, I don't think there are any easy answers. And I think it's really interesting actually, because I think the dynamic is a bit different as well. As I talk in the book, I don't draw the comparison, but I cite Anthony Barnett, the writer, who drew the comparison between Wigan in England and Paisley in Scotland in the referendum, where the two towns that he drew attention to were actually quite similar in many ways in terms of their industrial history, their demographic, their size, etc. The impacts that they'd had from globalization. But whereas the vote in Wigan was very strongly pro-Leave, the vote in Paisley was very strongly pro-Remain in Scotland. So there's a different dynamic at play, and I don't have the answers, but it's pretty clear to me that until or unless we win back, a certain chunk of Scotland, then probably we won't win back Westminster.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And Andy, you've got a question, an interesting question about comparisons with the Conservatives, really.
Hi, it was really fascinating talk, by the way. I really enjoyed it. But I'm interested in civil liberties and the way that the state has taken unprecedented control over our lives. And I think, sleepwalk towards utter catastrophe, and accepting it with very, very little complaint. And we're accepting local elections being cancelled for how long, we don't know. So we've got a Conservative government that's acting in a manner that most people would have feared a socialist government would have acted, with heavy state control and removal of individual liberties. I'm just interested in your thoughts on the current landscape in that respect.
Thanks, Andrew. I absolutely share your concerns. I mean, I'm not inherently locked down. I mean, you didn't use the word lockdown, but I'm assuming you were sort of talking about the current situation with lockdown. Yeah. I mean, one thing I find quite worrying actually is if anyone describes themselves as a lockdown skeptic, they are, by large parts of the media and political establishment, completely demonized. You know, how dare you be a lockdown skeptic? Almost as if to voice any skepticism about the fact that a government has done all of the things that you say, you know, has cancelled elections, has effectively put people under house arrest to all intents and purposes for now the best part of a year, almost as if to be skeptical about that is wrong. Well, why wouldn't we be skeptical about that? I mean, whatever the reasons for it, and I understand the arguments, but surely it's not illegitimate for people to question it or to challenge it or to say that this is such a departure from the norm and this has fundamentally changed our liberties and our freedoms in a way that we haven't seen. You know, often people say since wartime. Actually, some of the restrictions are even more authoritarian than we've seen in wartime. Yeah, at least let's have the debate about that. At least let's talk about the end game. At least let's talk about, you know, when these powers and these restrictions are going to come to an end, and what the criteria will be for them coming to an end. And I just kind of feel that, I mean, look, in a civilized society, of course, you know, if you've got a pandemic, you want to protect the most vulnerable people from it. You know, it's the humane thing to do and absolutely the right thing to do. But I think there are legitimate arguments about the best way to go about that.
My biggest concern is that I don't think the opposition have represented the case for having that debate. They've just supported unquestioningly, it seems, everything that the government have offered. Ofcom have even put in place revised legislation that discourages anyone in the media from debating the legitimacy of that the government is stating. I find that astonishing. And I find it astonishing that Keir Starmer, to me, has failed miserably to at least demand that there is a public debate over the rights and wrongs, and he seems to be a patsy for the government.
I broadly agree, and I think some of the stuff around social media, where, I mean, we've seen some of the heavy-handedness of people being denied the opportunity to voice any criticism. I mean, the radio station Talk Radio had its entire channel deleted from YouTube simply because it gave a voice to people who were sceptical of lockdown, people like Peter Hitchens and others. Now, eventually, you know, it had the power to lobby and get that put back on. But there's undoubtedly an effort, I think, to clamp down on any dissent. And I do worry about the future in terms of the impact on the economy, thousands of jobs being lost, entire businesses and potentially industries being wiped out, the impacts on people's mental health, cardiovascular disease, cancer treatments, etc. I'm not saying there isn't a case for lockdown. Of course, there's an argument for it, and you know, part of that argument is convincing. There's no question about it. But I think we need to analyse the impact of it much more closely than we've done, and I don't think we should be dismissive of people who raise genuine concerns about it.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Andy. Let me bring it to a close. We're just over the hour. Really appreciate your contribution, Paul. It's been significant, a really interesting debate. Thanks on behalf of Downtown in Business. The book is exceptionally good, and it's certainly ruffling feathers So if you haven't read Despised, as Frank is showing us, then I suggest you do. Well worth a read. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, everyone. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.